On the day of the 2017 NBA draft, the Chicago Bulls signaled a rebuild after trading away their franchise player in the peak of his prime, at the age of 27, to the Minnesota Timberwolves in exchange for Zach Lavine, who was coming off an ACL injury, Lauri Markkanen, and Chris Dunn. Fast forward to today, 5 years later, you still have people talking about this trade and whether the Bulls made a mistake in moving on from Jimmy Butler at such a young age. And that narrative has increased even more so as we see Jimmy Butler balling out in the playoffs yet again after leading the Miami Heat to the second conference finals in just 3 years. So in today's video, we're going to be diving into this trade even further, rewinding the clock and taking a look at why the Bulls made this trade and whether this trade actually was something that they wish that they could take back. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bull Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I should add, I did make a video closer to the time that I started this channel, actually, around the Jimmy Butler trade and whether the Bulls ultimately won this trade, as we were starting to see the rise of Zach Lavine. And Jimmy Butler, although having made the finals in the bubble, got bounced in the first round in a sweep by the Bucks the following season. What's funny about sports is that there's just always so much recency bias that in 2020, it was no question the Bulls lost that trade by giving up Jimmy Butler after he went to the finals, to then, well, the Bulls made the right call after having a fairly subpar season for Jimmy in 2021, to now yet again, well, the Bulls really screwed up this trade since we're seeing Jimmy completely locked into these 2022 playoffs. But anyway, I made a video at that time revisiting the Jimmy Butler trade, and to be honest, my stance still really hasn't changed that much on it. So let's take a look back at what transpired leading up to that draft night trade in 2017. Now, it's important to note that after the Bulls were eliminated from the playoffs in the second round in 2015, the Bulls front office, after 5 years, decided to move on from Tom Thibodeau and hired first-time NBA head coach Fred Hoiberg, which that in and of itself was a mistake that really led to the fall of the Bulls. And despite the Bulls virtually keeping the roster the same and running it back, running that 2015 roster back now under Fred Hoiberg, well, the team disappointed and missed the playoffs entirely. The first time the Bulls had missed the playoffs since 2007. Then the Bulls traded away Derrick Rose, as it was clear he wasn't going to be returning to MVP form. He didn't fit that well with Jimmy Butler, and after letting Pau Gasol walk in free agency, the front office pulled one of the odder moves in franchise history in bringing in a past prime Dwayne Wade on a big contract, as well as Rajon Rondo, to put alongside Jimmy Butler. When it was clear that that crew didn't work after they finished 8th in the East and were knocked out of the first round of the playoffs, the Bulls decided, maybe Jimmy Butler isn't our guy that we want to build the franchise around. Let's cut our losses and trade him while his trade value is still high. Now, I think it's important to note that despite the play from Jimmy Butler in rising to become an all-star and being one of the best two-way players in the NBA, you cannot forget that Jimmy did often clash with his teammates, the coaching staff, and the front office. What was once a very humble kid entering the league as a late first rounder, not getting a ton of playing time in his first couple of seasons, to then becoming a very impactful player, getting a large 5-year contract, his head began to grow a bit. Now, you can't really fault Jimmy all that much for getting frustrated with his teammates in the front office, because the front office was completely incompetent and did not do that great of a job in building around him. But at the same time, there is something to be said that Jimmy, although yes, would play incredibly hard and played with maximum effort on most games, there were often times, especially in the final season, where Jimmy's effort on the court dropped and he looked like he didn't care. I know some people are not going to agree with that take, because how could you say that someone like Jimmy Butler, a dude that gives 100% on the floor all the time? But go back and watch some of these games from the 2016-17 season and you'll see what I mean. There are multiple possessions where Jimmy would just quit when things weren't going his way. On top of that, let's not forget that despite the Bulls having a disappointing season in 2017 to where they barely squeaked into the playoffs, they came out firing in that first round and won the first 2 games of the series against the number 1 seed Boston Celtics. They went up 2-0 going back home to the United Center. Unfortunately, Rondo gets injured, which was a big loss because playoff Rondo, but Jimmy Butler, the leader of that team with Dwayne Wade, could not muster up a single win after game 2 and lost the next 4 games in that series to get eliminated. And if you go back and watch that series, Jimmy more or less quit on that team in the last 2 games. They had a chance to knock off the number 1 seed, and Jimmy's demeanor, his effort, the way that he carried himself in general wasn't what you wanted to see from your star player in a playoff series for which you were up 2-0 against the number 1 seed. Now again, I'm not advocating that the Bulls trading away Jimmy was a smart move because of everything I just said. Far from it. No, I was actually pissed when they traded away Jimmy on draft night, but at the same time, I also get the fact that the last couple of seasons when Jimmy Butler was with the Bulls, he didn't exactly have the best attitude. And you saw that extended even after he was traded with the issues he ran into the Minnesota Timberwolves, basically forcing his way out after one season, calling the players soft, shouting at management in practice, saying that you need me. And of course, things didn't work out with the half season that he played in Philadelphia as well. Now, all of this to say, Jimmy is still a great basketball player, even 5 years later, and he's playing at an elite level at the age of 32, and may even be on his way to leading the Miami Heat to the finals yet again. Like, I think we can all agree that Jimmy is a guy you can build a franchise around. But Jimmy is also the type of player who is pretty high maintenance when it comes to his expectations of the team and coaching staff around him, which that's how a lot of great players are, right? You think to guys like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, they only wanted competitors around them, guys that were going to take the game seriously and want to win. But anyway, the point is, Jimmy didn't want to be in Chicago. And the front office, after making the colossal mistake of trying to put Rondo and Wade alongside him, and with Jimmy not satisfied with the crew they decided to put together, they decided to pull the trigger for a rebuild, which they got an all-star in return in Zach Lavine, even though they didn't know it at the time. Granted, I wouldn't say that Zach Lavine is a better player than Jimmy Butler, especially with how great of a two-way player Jimmy is, but the fact that you were still able to get a young talent in Zach Lavine, and you also got two other young talents in Lauri Markkanen and Chris Dunn, even though they didn't work out, that made it more or less of an okay trade. Do I think the Bulls ultimately won the trade 5 years later? No, I don't, because Jimmy is still playing at a very high level, and it's clear you could have built around him with the right pieces and with the right front office, which the Bulls didn't have at the time. But the point is, I think Jimmy Butler would have ultimately forced his way out of Chicago under Gar Pax had the Bulls not traded him in 2017. And it would have taken away any leverage the Bulls had in making a trade for him. And they would have had to settle for really what the Timberwolves had to do in trading Jimmy Butler for Robert Covington and Dario Saric. Yes, the Timberwolves traded away Jimmy Butler, a perennial all-star and an all-NBA player, for Covington and Dario Saric, because when a player demands a trade and it's made public, teams know they can get a star for pennies on the dollar, usually anyway. So the fact that the Bulls recognized that early on and were able to get a better return for Jimmy is a win, even though it may not seem like a win in hindsight when you see Jimmy Butler dominating in the playoffs and leading his team on another deep run in the playoffs. But I would love to hear what you guys think, though. Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.